Most people think of Japan as the land of samurai, shoguns, and legendary warriors. But for most of Japanese history, samurai didn't even exist. For centuries, Japan was ruled by emperors and powerful aristocrats, while the imperial court devoted itself to poetry, art, and politics. The countryside was slowly falling into chaos. As the government's control weakened, local communities began taking up arms to protect themselves. Over time, these warriors formed a new social class known as the Bushi. They would become the ancestors of the samurai known around the world today. With every generation, their power grew. Small warrior bands evolved into powerful clans that would soon plunge Japan into centuries of conflict and permanently reshape the nation's history. Among them, two clans rose above all others, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both served the imperial court, but as the Taira became increasingly powerful, tensions across Japan began to rise. The conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans gradually escalated into open war. In 1180, Prince Mochihito, a member of the imperial family, called on the samurai to rise up against the Taira clan's rule. Surprisingly, the Minamoto clan responded to this call, leading to the Genpei War. Initially, the Minamoto clan's position was far from favorable, but in eastern Japan, a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo gradually began to gather strength. He would become the clan's political leader. Meanwhile, another member of the clan, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, rose to prominence on the battlefield, eventually becoming so influential that Yoritomo came to see him as a threat and had him eliminated. His rapid campaigns and surprise attacks allowed the Minamoto army to achieve several decisive victories over the Taira forces. By the mid-1180s, the advantage gradually shifted to the Minamoto side. The final act of the war was the naval battle in Dano-Ura in 1185. In this battle, the Taira forces were decisively routed. In 1189, the great warrior Minamoto no Yoshitsune, after long wanderings and the defeat of his army in the north of the country, committed seppuku, thus ending the Heian Period. However, the Minamoto clan's victory in the Genpei War did not immediately resolve all problems. The emperor remained the sole legitimate source of power, and the Minamoto clan itself was under severe pressure from the court. As a result, Yoritomo began a political and military struggle to consolidate his own power. He would later become the man who would create an entirely new model of national governance. Instead of ruling from the capital, Yoritomo moved the center of power to Kamakura, in the east of the country, as a symbol of the new birth of Japan. In 1192, the emperor officially granted Yoritomo the title of shogun, or supreme military ruler. From this point on, power in the country was divided. The emperor continued to rule formally, but actual control passed to the military government, the shogunate. Thus began an era in which Japan was effectively ruled by samurai, a system that would last for nearly 700 years. After Yoritomo's death, the clan fell victim to intrigue, and another clan, the Hojo, began to rule the shogunate. This marks the return of the regency system we discussed in the first video. Instead of the emperor, who now holds virtually no power, regents rule through the shoguns. In general, all of early Japan was often ruled by more powerful clans instead of official authority. By 1219, however, the entire male line of the Minamoto house had completely disappeared, and representatives of other aristocratic families began to be appointed to the post of shogun. However, the Hojo clan still effectively ruled the Kamakura Shogunate. Despite the political intrigue, it was during this era that samurai Japan finally took shape. At the same time, Zen Buddhism began to spread among the samurai. This philosophy proved particularly appealing to the warrior class. Zen brought discipline, inner peace, and the acceptance of death, qualities ideally suited to the life of a warrior. But the most serious test for the Kamakura Shogunate would come from overseas. In the 13th century, a new power emerged on the mainland, the Mongol Empire. Under the rule of Kublai Khan, it rapidly expanded, subjugating ever more territories in Asia. After conquering China, the Mongols turned their attention to Japan. Kublai Khan demanded that the Japanese court recognize the authority of the Mongol Empire. But the Kamakura Shogunate refused to submit, and in protest, the Japanese executed the Mongol ambassador. History shows that the Mongols were deeply displeased, and in response, they began preparing a large-scale invasion. The first expedition took place in 1274. A massive fleet of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers approached the shores of Japan. The Mongol army, although more powerful, faced terrible resistance from the Japanese. The Mongol army also suffered serious logistical problems, and the final factor was a typhoon, later dubbed kamikaze by the Japanese, that is, a divine wind, which helped completely destroy the Mongol fleet. However, this was only the first attempt. A few years later, the Mongols prepared an even larger invasion. It was a kind of Normandy landing of the Middle Ages. In 1281, one of the largest fleets of the medieval world approached the shores of Japan. Only this time, the invasion ended in complete disaster. Japan had been thoroughly prepared for this landing, especially due to an incredibly fortunate coincidence of events. The second Mongol invasion was also accompanied by a terrible typhoon, and the Mongols only exacerbated the logistical problems. A fair estimate of the number of soldiers involved in the landing places the number at around 100,000. At least that's what older sources say, which is very likely an exaggeration. And with 13th century technology, even such a powerful empire as the Mongol Empire couldn't cope with such a large-scale plan, losing around 80% of its army. Although Japan was able to repel the Mongol invasions, the victory was far from as triumphant as it might have seemed. The Kamakura Shogunate expended enormous resources on the country's defense, building fortifications, maintaining the army, and constantly preparing for new invasions greatly exhausted the state. But the samurai posed the most serious problem. Thousands of warriors participated in the country's defense and expected rewards, lands, titles, or riches. However, this war produced no conquered territories to distribute to the victors. Discontent among the military class gradually grew. By the beginning of the 14th century, the Kamakura Shogunate was weakened both economically and politically. The power of the Hojo clan increasingly irritated other samurai families, and in 1333, this system finally began to crumble. Emperor Go-Daigo, an ambitious man seeking to return real power to the imperial court and restore a full-fledged monarchy, emerged on the horizon. After a series of failed rebellions and even finding himself in a desperate situation at the time, with the help of his son, he finally managed to organize a rebellion that spread throughout Japan, with more and more clans siding with the emperor. After a series of battles, the Hojo regime was overthrown, and Kamakura fell. Thus ended the reign of the first shogunate. But the emperor's attempt to restore the old order would be short-lived. Japan would soon find itself once again embroiled in a power struggle, leading the country into a brief period of the Kemmu Restoration. After the fall of the Kamakura Shogunate, it seemed that the power of the samurai had ended, and Japan was returning to the old order. Emperor Go-Daigo finally had the chance to restore direct court rule. However, the country had changed greatly during this time. The samurai and military clans were no longer willing to submit solely to the court nobility. Many expected rewards and influence for their assistance in overthrowing the Hojo, but instead they saw an attempt to reinstate the old system. After several reforms, discontent began to grow almost immediately. The main figure in this new crisis was Ashikaga Takeuji, one of those who helped Go-Daigo rise to power. He quickly turned against the emperor, rebelled, and marched on Kyoto. In 1336, Takeuji's forces occupied the capital. Go-Daigo fled to the south, where he established his own court in Yoshino. Japan was once again divided. The brief Kemmu Restoration ended, and instead of peace, the country was ushered into one of the bloodiest periods in Japanese history. After defeating Go-Daigo, Ashikaga Takayuji finally consolidated power in the hands of the military government. In 1338, he received the title of shogun and founded a new shogunate in Kyoto. The emperor remained in office, but as before, he increasingly became a symbolic figure, while real power rested with the shogun and his allies. Unlike the Kamakura regime, the Ashikaga regime was unable to establish a rigid vertical chain of command. To hold the country together, the shogunate was forced to rely on local military armies, and were increasingly dependent on orders from the capital. It was from this system that the future daimyo of the Sengoku period would later emerge. At the end of the 14th century, the division of the country formally ended. In 1392, the Southern Court recognized the authority of the Ashikaga line, and Japan once again united under a single emperor. However, this unification changed little. Decisive issues were still decided not at court, but among the growing regional clans. Despite the shogunate's weak policies, the early Muromachi period became a time of cultural revival. Under the patronage of the shoguns, Zen Buddhism, no theater, rock gardens, ink painting, and tea culture developed. Many of the images associated with traditional Japan today took shape during this period. But by the mid-15th century, Japan once again found itself on the brink of disaster. In 1467, a dispute over the succession to power in the Ashikaga shogunate pitted two powerful clans, the Yamana and the Hosokawa, against each other. What began as a conflict at court quickly escalated into a war that would destroy the old order. The armies of the largest clans entered Kyoto. The capital, considered the heart of Japan for centuries, became a battlefield. Kyoto, one of the largest and most beautiful cities in the 15th century, began to crumble into ruins. Fighting erupted over every street, even near the imperial palace. The central government was powerless to stop the chaos. The Onin War lasted nearly 10 years and failed. It brought no one a true victory, but that was precisely its greatest danger. The old order was completely broken. The shogunate lost its last vestiges of authority, and throughout the country, military clans increasingly began to act independently. After the Onin War, Japan entered the Sengoku period, a century of endless wars, betrayals, and power struggles between powerful houses. Power would spread throughout the country, and the resulting chaos would be resolved by nothing less than the sword, the army, and the talent of a commander. So, a great and bloody period in Japanese history, a time of decentralization and the emergence of a new order. One of the first to take advantage of the new order was the Hojo clan in the Kanto region. Their power was built not only on war, but also on competent governance. They fortified Odawara, turning it into one of the most powerful castles in the country, established tax collection, and built a stable system of control over their lands. Thanks to this, the Hojo were considered more than just a military clan, but a full-fledged state within Japan. Many understood that opposing them in the east meant becoming embroiled in a long and difficult war. In the central part of the country, the Imagawa clan was becoming a particularly dangerous force. Their lands were rich, populous, and located on the vital route between the east and Kyoto. While other clans exhausted themselves in local conflicts, the Imagawa gradually accumulated resources. The head of the clan, Imagawa Yoshimoto, had a reputation as a serious and calculating ruler. For many contemporaries, he was seen as the man who would one day enter Kyoto and take control of the country. The Takeda clan was no less formidable. Under Takeda Shingen's rule, their domains transformed into one of the most effective military systems of the era. He threatened administration, brought order to taxes, and created an army respected even by his enemies, as few could match Takeda's legendary cavalry. His lands were not considered the richest, but Shingen compensated for this with discipline, reforms, and an ability to swiftly conduct campaigns. The Takeda name aroused concern among his neighbors, for behind him stood not just a clan, but a talented strategist. However, Shingen faced an equally dangerous man, Uesugi Kenshin. While Shingen was renowned for his calculation and organization, Kenshin went down in history as a brilliant commander with enormous personal authority. Their rivalry became one of the symbols of the era, Their series of battles at Kawanakajima failed to bring a decisive victory to either side, but created an almost legendary reputation for both rulers. For the rest of Japan, this was a reminder: as long as two titans restrained each other, the balance of power remained. Meanwhile, in the West, the Mori clan was rising. They operated differently from many of their rivals. While some relied primarily on open battles, the Mori skillfully combined diplomacy, alliances, the gradual subjugation of neighbors, and naval strength. Step by step, they became the masters of the Chugoku region and began to control important sea routes. By the mid-16th century, it was impossible to discuss Western Japanese policy without taking the Mori interests into account. By the mid-16th century, Japan was essentially divided among the titans of the time. Each house had its own advantages and disadvantages compared to the others. And that's why many contemporaries believed that Japan's future would be decided between the already established giants. Smaller houses were hardly taken seriously against this backdrop. I think for those who played Crusader Kings 3, or for example, my favorite, Total War Shogun 2, this entire area will seem suspiciously familiar. Powerful houses, colorful characters with their own distinctive skills, intrigue, the skillful management of the state and the army. The Sengoku period is essentially one big bloody game, which is perfectly conveyed in such games. Among these secondary powers was the inconspicuous Oda clan from Owari province. Their lands were important, but the clan itself was far from an undisputed contender for power over the entire country. Moreover, the clan had its own share of conflicts. It seemed like just another minor clan, soon to be absorbed by a neighboring giant. The clan's authority rested on a man named Oda Nobuhide. He expanded the family's influence and made Owari a major regional power. However, after his death in 1551, the Oda house immediately plunged into a struggle for succession. And then, Nobuhide's eldest son, Oda Nobunaga, entered the arena. He did not seem destined for a great future. Even within his own family, he was distrusted. He was considered a strange, rude, and unworthy heir, and some vassals supported other contenders. For many, the future of the Oda clan lay in question. It looked like a typical internal collapse, of which there were many in that era. But Nobunaga quickly showed that underestimating him was a mistake. He suppressed rebellious vassals, eliminated rivals, including his own brothers, which I think reflects the bloodiness of the era, and completely subjugated Owari. This man was literally in one of the worst positions from the very beginning. Immediately after he seized sole power in his own province, he was overtaken by one of the greatest warriors of the era. In 1560, Imagawa Yoshimoto, previously mentioned as the likely future ruler of the country, advanced on his lands. For most, this looked like the end for Nobunaga, as the forces were too unequal. However, instead of waiting for Imagawa at the castle, Nobunaga opted for the attack. At Okehazama, he made such a bold and unpredictable move that it caused all of Japan to truly take notice of the Oda clan for the first time. Taking advantage of the bad weather and the element of surprise, he advanced deep into the enemy lines, directly toward the camp where Imagawa was celebrating the successful start of the campaign, risking being surrounded at any moment by the remaining Imagawa forces. The horror and bewilderment that overtook the main Imagawa force upon realizing that Nobunaga's best troops were advancing toward them was incomparable. Many fled before the battle even began. The rest were routed, and Yoshimoto himself died, after which the entire army fled. This battle became a turning point for an era. It was on that day, amid the rain, chaos, and bloodshed at Okehazama, that Japan first heard the name Oda Nobunaga. The first important step was strengthening alliances. Nobunaga drew closer to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had previously been under the influence of the Imagawa and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his subordinate, who had begun his career as a sandal wearer, but demonstrated his military and leadership qualities at Okehajima. This alliance would prove to be one of the most important in all of Japanese history. Then began the march on the capital. In 1568, Oda troops entered Kyoto. Nobunaga formally restored the Ashikaga shogunate, installing Ashikaga Yoshiaki as shogun. Yoshiaki quickly sought to rid himself of this overly powerful ally and began to assemble a coalition against Oda. It included Nobunaga's old enemies, influential monastic powers, and major clans fearful of his rise. Essentially, all of old Japan was trying to stop the man who was breaking the established rules of the game. Nobunaga's response was harsh. He didn't try to please anyone or seek endless compromises. He defeated some enemies in open campaigns, deprived others of their allies, and sometimes some of the most dangerous opponents died before they could finish the fight against the Oda. The most famous episode was the massacre of the Enryakuji Monastic Center on Mount Hiei near Kyoto in 1571. For decades, armed monks had interfered in politics and supported their advantageous sides. Nobunaga demonstrated that even such forces were no longer immune to attack. The next serious threat remained the Takeda clan. After the death of Takeda Shingen, their army was still considered one of the strongest in Japan. But in 1575 at Nagashino, the forces of Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu inflicted a crushing defeat on the Takeda. The massive use of arquebusiers, fortifications, and discipline became a symbol of a new era of warfare. By the mid-1570s, Nobunaga controlled much of central Japan. He developed trade, weakened old privileges, built new centers of power, and gradually approached the unification of the country. What had recently seemed impossible was becoming a reality. But in 1582, everything was turned upside down again. One of his confidants, Akechi Mitsuhide, rebelled. Nobunaga found himself surrounded at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, realizing there was no way out, and committed seppuku. Upon learning of the betrayal, Toyotomi Hideyoshi quickly returns from the front, defeats Akechi Mitsuhide, and, before others have time to recover from the shock, seizes control. Later, Tokugawa Ieyasu, after a power struggle with Toyotomi, decides to cede power to Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi then begins a struggle for Nobunaga's legacy, destroying or subjugating the remaining daimyo, and by the end of the 16th century, he has essentially unified Japan. After decades of endless warfare, the country regains a single center of power. Hideyoshi conducts land censuses, strengthens his control over the provinces, and attempts to consolidate order to prevent a repeat of the Sengoku era. However, in his later years, Hideyoshi changes significantly. Hideyoshi finally fathered a son, only for the boy to die several years later from an unknown illness. The death of his child hits the ruler hard, and his contemporaries increasingly note his suspiciousness and cruelty. Against this backdrop of crisis, he draws Japan into arduous campaigns against Korea. The war demands enormous resources, drags on, and fails to bring a decisive victory. Instead of finally strengthening the state, the country once again finds itself exhausted. Eventually, he has a son who survives, but Hideyoshi himself dies very soon after. Since his son is still very young, a council of regents is created to govern. Among the regents was none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu, who by this point had become one of the most influential men in all of Japan. Ieyasu quickly begins to strengthen his own power, realizing that the country is once again left without a strong ruler. The decisive moment comes at the Battle of Sekigahara. Ieyasu's victory destroys his opponents. In 1603, he receives the title of shogun and establishes the Tokugawa Shogunate, centered in Edo, the future Tokyo. After more than a century of chaos, Japan is finally entering an era of long peace, strict order, and a complete restructuring of the state. After a century of warfare, the Tokugawa Shogunate established a strict system of control. Supervision over the daimyo was tightened, foreign contracts were restricted, Christianity, which by this time had already become quite widespread, was banned, and trade with foreigners was permitted only in a few strictly controlled ports. Thus, Japan entered a period of prolonged isolation. The country gradually calmed down. Major wars became a thing of the past. Old battlefields became overgrown with grass, and the samurai sword increasingly became a symbol of a bygone era. But behind the outward order, new problems lurked. Many peasants continued to live in poverty. The samurai, born as a military class, eventually faced debt and declining incomes, and the country itself fell further and further behind the rapidly changing world beyond its borders. And yet, for many generations, this world seemed natural. But while the Japanese are trying to maintain stability by isolating themselves, the world around them is already living in a completely different time. I mentioned this in the first video about Japan, and it's a clear example of how cyclical this is in Japan. And then comes the 19th century. Eerie alien black ships appear on the horizon. Dark silhouettes slowly enter the waters of a country that has lived by its own rules for too long. The Japanese don't yet know that, with them, the old era is ending, and a completely different Japan is beginning.
Stars, that to me is what your eyes are. Soft as stars in April skies are. Tell me someday you'll fulfill their promise of a thrill.